There is something almost cruelly perfect about the latest chapter in Mason Rudolph's Steelers story. Big Ben, the same quarterback whose shadow hung over Rudolph from the moment Pittsburgh drafted him, has now said the Steelers should move on from Mason and keep the younger options Will Howard and Drew Aller because one of them might become the long-term answer after Aaron Rodgers. On the surface, it is a normal roster argument. Rudolph is an established veteran, the younger quarterbacks are developmental investments, and Pittsburgh cannot keep everybody. But when you pull the camera back and look at the entire relationship, it feels less like a routine decision and more like the ending of a circle that started 8 years ago. In 2018, the Steelers traded up in the third round to select Rudolph, a quarterback they reportedly graded much higher than where he was taken, and a player many people immediately viewed as a possible successor to Big Ben. Pittsburgh moved from pick 79 to pick 76 to get him, which made the choice feel deliberate rather than accidental. This was not a late-round flyer who could disappear quietly if he failed. The organization had attached meaning to the selection, and that meaning immediately placed Rudolph between the past Pittsburgh was still celebrating and the future it knew would eventually arrive. Rudolph had not even taken an NFL practice snap before the conversation became uncomfortable. Big Ben publicly wondered how spending that pick on a quarterback helped the Steelers win right then, while also speaking up for Landry Jones and Josh Dobbs, the players already in the room. Big Ben later said he would help Rudolph, but the message surrounding the rookie was impossible to miss. He had arrived as the possible replacement for a franchise legend who had no interest in being replaced. That was the beginning of Rudolph's career in Pittsburgh, not with a clean runway, not with a patient rebuilding plan, but with the pressure of representing a future the current face of the franchise was not ready to accept. Rudolph spent his rookie year inactive, waiting and learning, and then the opportunity came in the most abrupt way possible. Big Ben suffered a season-ending elbow injury in Week 2 of 2019, and suddenly Rudolph went from a developmental backup to the man expected to hold together a season built around someone else. He was not handed an offense designed for his strengths or a year in which the organization could tolerate growing pains. He was replacing one of the most accomplished quarterbacks in NFL history while trying to prove he belonged at all. Rudolph won games, had stretches where he looked composed and helped keep Pittsburgh alive, but every performance was judged against Big Ben, and every mistake became evidence that the Steelers had no future at quarterback. He started 8 games that year and threw 13 touchdown passes, enough to show why the Steelers had invested in him, but not enough to quiet a city accustomed to watching Big Ben rescue broken plays and late drives. Then, only a few starts into that opportunity, the story became frightening. Against Baltimore, Earl Thomas hit Rudolph high as he delivered a pass. Rudolph went limp, fell to the turf, and remained down while teammates and medical personnel surrounded him. The image was disturbing because it was bigger than football. This was a young quarterback finally receiving the chance he had waited for, and in an instant the discussion was no longer about whether he could replace Big Ben, it was about whether he was conscious. He returned later that month, but his first extended season had already been broken into 2 separate realities: the player trying to establish himself before the hit, and the player attempting to regain his rhythm after being knocked unconscious. In a normal career, that concussion might have remained the defining hardship. For Mason Rudolph, it was only the beginning of the chaos. A little more than a month after Rudolph was knocked unconscious against Baltimore, he found himself at the center of one of the ugliest scenes the NFL has ever put on national television. The Steelers were finishing a miserable Thursday night loss in Cleveland when a confrontation with Myles Garrett escalated beyond anything that belongs on a football field. Garrett pulled Rudolph's helmet off and swung it into his exposed head. In only a few seconds, Rudolph went from a struggling young quarterback trying to survive a divisional game to the central figure in a national controversy. Garrett was suspended, Rudolph apologized for his role in escalating the confrontation, and then the situation became even darker when Garrett later alleged that Rudolph had used a racial slur. Rudolph strongly denied it, and the NFL said it found no evidence supporting the allegation, but by that point his name was permanently tied to the incident. Think about the sequence. He had already been knocked unconscious earlier that season, then his own helmet was used as a weapon against him, and instead of being allowed to process either moment privately, he had to answer questions from the entire country. 9 days later, football offered no mercy. Rudolph struggled against the winless Bengals and was benched for undrafted rookie Devlin Duck Hodges, who led Pittsburgh to a comeback victory and suddenly became a fan phenomenon. Rudolph had entered the year as the carefully developed heir behind Big Ben. Now he was watching an undrafted quarterback with a hunting nickname take his job. When Hodges later collapsed against the Jets, the Steelers turned back to Rudolph. Mason came off the bench, gave the offense a spark, and appeared to be earning another chance only to suffer a serious shoulder injury that ended his season. That entire 2019 campaign became a compressed version of his career. Promotion, trauma, controversy, humiliation, redemption, and another injury before he could finish the job. There was no normal developmental arc inside any of it. Pittsburgh was trying to win immediately, and Rudolph was being judged while carrying circumstances that would have overwhelmed far more established players. He never received an uninterrupted stretch in which the only question was how well he could play quarterback. Even the stories away from the field somehow became strange. Rudolph had beaten Josh Dobbs for the backup job. Dobbs was traded to Jacksonville, and then Dobbs eventually returned to the same Steelers quarterback room. Around that time, former Bachelor contestant Hannah Ann Sluice was publicly linked in reports to both quarterbacks. The exact nature and timing of those relationships were never firmly established, so it should not be presented as proven that they literally shared the same girlfriend, but the fact that the story even existed captures the absurd atmosphere around Rudolph. He was already competing with Dobbs for his professional future, and now their names were connected in tabloid headlines too. Then came 2022 when Big Ben finally retired, and the path that Rudolph had supposedly been drafted to inherit should have opened. General manager Kevin Colbert said that if the season began at that moment, Mason would be the starter. Pittsburgh then signed Mitchell Trubisky and drafted Kenny Pickett in the first round. Rudolph went from temporary favorite to third wheel in a matter of weeks. When an official depth chart listed him ahead of Pickett, Mike Tomlin called it a clerical error, and the order was corrected with Rudolph moved down. That small moment carried enormous symbolism. The man once drafted as Big Ben's possible successor had waded through injuries, benchings, and public doubt, and when Big Ben's chair was finally empty, the organization treated Rudolph being listed second as a mistake that needed to be fixed. He was inactive for all 17 regular season games, present every week but functionally removed from the competition he had once been told he could lead. By the start of the 2023 season, Mason Rudolph had become almost invisible in Pittsburgh. Kenny Pickett was the young starter, Mitchell Trubisky was the veteran backup, and Rudolph had returned on a modest one-year deal to occupy a third-string role that offered almost no public path back to relevance. He spent most of the year receiving limited work while the Steelers' offense staggered through games. And even as Pickett was injured and Trubisky struggled, Pittsburgh resisted turning to Mason until the season was nearly gone. That is what made the ending so powerful. When Rudolph finally started against Cincinnati in December, he did not merely manage the game. He threw for 290 yards, connected on explosive plays, and led the Steelers to a 34-11 victory that felt like the first time the offense had breathed in months. He followed it by winning in Seattle, then handled a rain-soaked finale in Baltimore, completing 90% of his passes and helping Pittsburgh reach the playoffs. Across those 3 regular season starts, Rudolph completed more than 74% of his throws, averaged 9.7 yards per attempt, produced a 118.0 passer rating, and did not throw an interception. The quarterback, who had been buried behind Pickett and Trubisky, gave Pittsburgh its best sustained stretch of quarterback play that season when the margin for error had disappeared. He then started the playoff game in Buffalo, and although the Steelers lost, his late-season run changed the way many people viewed his entire career. For years, every Rudolph opportunity had come with an explanation for why it did not really count. He won because of the defense. He was only playing because somebody got hurt. He was a backup, a temporary solution, an emergency option. In 2023, the emergency option rescued the season after the preferred plans failed. Yet even that was not enough to create a permanent home. Rudolph left in free agency and signed with Tennessee, where he appeared in 8 games and started 5 during the 2024 season. It seemed like the strange Pittsburgh chapter had finally closed, then 1 year later he chose to return. The Steelers signed him to a 2-year contract in March 2025, and Rudolph explained that Pittsburgh was a special place, pointing to his friendships, his comfort with the organization, and the relationships he had built. That decision says more about him than any passer rating could. He returned to the team that drafted him into an awkward quarterback room, watched him get knocked unconscious, saw him struck with his own helmet, benched him for Duck Hodges, placed Trubisky and Pickett ahead of him, and publicly corrected a depth chart that accidentally gave him too much standing. He returned because loyalty, familiarity, and unfinished business still meant something to him. In 2025, the pattern repeated. Rudolph replaced an injured Rodgers in a win over Cincinnati, then started the following week in a loss to Chicago. Once again, Pittsburgh kept him near the emergency glass. Now the story has reached another uncertain summer. Aaron Rodgers remains at the top. Howard and Aller represent the future. And Big Ben is again publicly arguing that Rudolph should be the one left out. Maybe the Steelers will agree. Maybe they will decide that younger potential matters more than veteran reliability. That is a defensible football decision. But it does not erase what Rudolph has endured or what he has given the organization. His Steelers career has never been a clean rise or a simple failure. It is a story about surviving long enough to become useful again, about being dismissed without becoming bitter, and about repeatedly answering the call for a franchise that rarely promised him anything. The final question is not whether Mason Rudolph became Big Ben's successor. He did not. The question is why, After every injury, controversy, demotion, and strange turn, he continued showing up for Pittsburgh, and why Pittsburgh always seemed to find its way back to him when everything else went wrong.